The snow didn't just fall that day, it judged. Each flake drifted down slow, deliberate, like a tiny white gavel coming down on Islaw Mayfield's life. The railway station was a skeleton picked clean by the blizzard, and she was the last bit of meat left on its bones. She stood on that deserted platform, a ghost in a worn-out shawl, trembling so hard she thought her teeth might shatter. Her boots were cracked, her cheeks were raw, but her eyes were stubborn. They scanned every face that hurried past, searching for a single drop of mercy in a town that had run dry. They didn't look long. The good folks of this town had perfected the art of looking away. A few glanced, a flicker of pity in their eyes, but it was like a match snuffed out before it could catch. Others just smirked. One old drunk, leaning against the mercantile post, laughed right at her. His words were a cloud of frozen poison. "There's the barn rat," he slurred. "Too proud to wed, too poor to eat." The words clung to her, colder than the wind. She already knew them. They were the same words that echoed in her own head every single night. But hearing them out loud, from them, it was like being stabbed with an icicle. Still, she straightened her back. She stepped forward. Her voice was a fragile thing, breaking against the wind. "I'll sleep in the barn," she begged, offering her last shred of dignity. "Just give me work." Her words scattered like seeds on frozen ground. No one bent to pick them up. The men just pulled their coats tighter. The women hugged their children closer, as if she were a disease. The doors to the saloon and the shop opened and closed, swallowing up all the warmth, leaving her in the cold. Her hunger was a wild animal, roaring in her belly, clawing at her throat. It was louder than their scorn, louder than the wind. But Ilah refused to bend. She'd learned a long time ago that when you bend too much, the world just snaps you in two. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford, but dignity was a thin thread, and it was all she had left. The snow started falling harder, angrier. The lanterns on the street swayed and hissed. She had to try one more time. She lifted her voice, desperate now, pleading. "I'll work for nothing," she cried out. Just don't send me away." Silence. A silence so deep and so cold it was sharper than any insult. It was the sound of a world that had no place for her. A final, crushing judgment. And then a shadow shifted. At the very edge of the crowd, a figure stood motionless, watching. He was taller than any man there, his chest bare beneath a draped buffalo hide, which seemed impossible in this cold. His skin was the color of burnished bronze, a stark contrast to the pale, falling snow. His hair was long and black, whipping in the wind like a battle flag. He was an Apache, unmistakable. The sheer weight of his presence drew every eye, silencing every whisper. He just stood there, his expression a mask carved from stone. Ilah felt his gaze on her before she even saw him. It was a physical pressure, like heat against ice, steady and unyielding. She flinched, not from fear, but from the shock of being truly seen. After a lifetime of being looked through, being seen felt like a raw wound. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The whispers started again, but different this time. Meaner, hungrier. "That's Tahan," someone hissed. "Red elk. Keeps to himself." Another voice dripping with venom. "Wild blood. Dangerous." A woman clutched her husband's arm. "Better she freezes than goes with him." The shame burned hotter than the frostbite on her cheeks. She lowered her head, wishing the snow would just swallow her whole. For so long she had been the town's spectacle, their cautionary tale, the girl left behind, the girl nobody wanted. And that's when Tahan moved. He didn't hurry, he didn't hesitate. He moved with the heavy, undeniable certainty of a mountain. The snow crunched under his boots as he closed the distance between them. The town fell completely silent. The only sounds were the hiss of the blizzard and the distant groan of the train engine cooling on the tracks. He stopped right in front of her. So close she could see the faint scars on his shoulders. So close she could see the frost clinging to his dark hair. So close she could see the absolute stillness in his eyes. For a single breathless moment, she forgot the cold. She forgot the crowd. She forgot everything but the man standing before her. Then he lifted one hand. It was a hand roughened by hard labor, a hand strong enough to split stone. He just offered it. No word, no explanation. The gesture stole the air from her lungs. She wanted to shrink back, to ask him what he meant, to beg him not to make her a pawn in some cruel game. But the hand didn't waver. It just hung there in the space between them, patient as the earth itself, as if he had already decided she was worth the offering. The crowd stirred. Someone hissed, "Don't you dare, Islaw!" Another man spat in the snow. The preacher, old Amos Clay, just shook his head, muttering a prayer that was too tired to rise. Islaw's legs felt like they were about to give out. She could hear her father's voice, rough with whiskey and disappointment, echoing in her memory. "You'll never be wanted. Not by man, not by God." She thought of the cold barn doors she had prayed would open for her. And then she thought of this hand, this impossible hand, waiting. Slowly, her fingers trembling, she reached out and placed her palm against his. The warmth of his skin was a shock, a jolt of life in the frozen world. His strength flowed into her, steadying her. He closed his hand around hers, not harshly, but with a firmness that felt like a pact being sealed. Gasps erupted from the crowd like gunfire. "She's lost! He'll shame her! It's a sin!" Tahan didn't even glance at them. He just turned, gently guiding her away from the platform. She stumbled beside him, her mind reeling, not daring to look back, though their hateful words followed her, clinging to her like frostbite. Words that would follow her long after the snow had melted. They walked past the saloon, its windows glowing with a warm, golden laughter she would never be a part of. They passed the church, its tall steeple a silent, stone finger pointing an accusing finger at the sky. At the edge of town, the buildings gave way to empty white fields and pine trees bowed heavy with ice. The road ahead looked endless, a path into nowhere. But the hand holding hers never loosened its grip. As they walked, the wind seemed to soften. The snowflakes landed gently on her eyelashes, catching like tiny diamonds in his dark hair. In stolen glances, she studied him, the hard set of his jaw, the silence that surrounded him, which felt less like emptiness and more like a language she just hadn't learned yet. Shame was still a heavy weight on her shoulders, whispering that she had gone too far, that she would never, ever be welcome again. But underneath it, something else stirred, a tiny coal glowing under a mountain of ash. A question, a wondering. Maybe being unwelcome everywhere else was the first step toward finally belonging somewhere. The cabin came into view through the swirling snow, half buried at the edge of the woods. It looked small and stubborn against the storm. A fragile thread of smoke curled from the stone chimney. He stopped at the threshold and finally he let go of her hand. She swayed, the loss of his touch making her feel unsteady all over again. Tahan pushed open the heavy wooden door. A wave of warmth spilled out, rich with the smell of pine smoke and hot iron. He stepped aside, his dark eyes fixed on her. He wasn't commanding her. He wasn't forcing her. He was waiting. Ilah hesitated. Behind her was the town with its cruel whispers and its closed doors. Ahead of her was this man, this silence, this unknown. Her heart pounded, the rhythm of a choice that would change everything. She crossed the threshold, the warmth wrapped around her like a blanket, so sudden and so complete it made her want to weep. A single fire burned low in a stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. There was a table scarred by years of use, a bedroll in the corner, folded with military precision. It was simple, sparse, but everything in the room felt alive with his presence. She clutched her shawl tighter, unsure where to stand, unsure what she had just walked into. He closed the door. The thud was a final, deafening sound, sealing the storm outside, sealing her inside. Without a word, he moved past her, his broad shoulders brushing against hers. He laid more wood on the fire, coaxing it to life until bright sparks flew up, and the room glowed with a soft, amber light. Ilah's chest ached with a feeling she couldn't name. She wanted to thank him. She wanted to explain that she had only asked for a barn, for a pile of straw, for nothing more than this. But her voice was a withered thing, and it died before it ever reached her lips. So she just watched him. This silent giant who had plucked her from a mob that was ready to cast stones. She watched the flames lick at the logs, painting his scarred shoulders in flickering gold. And she wondered, with a tremor that ran deeper than the cold, was she safe? Or had she merely traded one cage for another? Outside, the wind howled louder, as if the town itself was screaming its judgment across the frozen fields. Inside, the firelight flickered, her breath shivered in her chest, and her entire fate rested on a man who had not yet spoken a single word. His eyes lifted at last, dark and unblinking, and they found hers across the glowing room. Elah felt a terrifying jolt, a perfect mix of fear and hope, because in his gaze she saw no pity. She saw no scorn. She saw only a question she didn't know how to answer. The fire crackled, spitting embers onto the hearth. That small sound was the only thing that broke the crushing silence in the cabin. Isla stood by the door, still clutching her damp shawl, her heart still hammering like a war drum. She had braced herself for straw, for the gnawing bite of the cold, for a dark corner where she could disappear. This, this was something else entirely. The warmth, the solid walls, the silent presence of the man named Han. It unnerved her more than the storm. He moved about the small space, stacking logs with a practiced, deliberate care. His silence was a physical weight in the room. Elah shifted from one worn-out boot to the other, the floorboards groaning under her, as if they were speaking the unease she couldn't. Finally he gestured, a simple motion of his hand toward a single, sturdy chair by the fire. She hesitated. Pride warred with a need so deep it was in her bones. Need one. She lowered herself onto the chair, the wood hard beneath her. The heat from the fire stung her frozen cheeks, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, her fingers began to tingle as blood returned to them. She bit her lips so hard she tasted copper, fighting back tears. Tears would be a weakness. Tears would show him just how close she had been to shattering completely. Tahan crossed to a shelf, took down a clay pot, and scooped it full of fresh snow from just outside the door. He set it near the fire to melt. The action was so simple, so ordinary, yet he performed it with such focus. She watched him, trying to read him like a book written in a language she didn't know, searching for meaning in his gestures, in the rhythm of his quiet. The words "thank you" were a frantic bird beating its wings against the cage of her teeth, but she couldn't let them out. She was afraid they would sound like more begging, and she had done enough begging for 10 lifetimes. So she just sat there, her hands clenched in her lap, and let the crackling of the pine logs be the only conversation between them. Time dripped by, slow as melting icicles. The snow in the pot turned to water. The water began to steam. He poured the steaming water into a tin cup, dropped in a pinch of dried herbs from a leather pouch, and set the cup on the small table beside her. The warmth seeped through the tin, into her palms, into her chest. She took a sip. It was bitter and earthy, but it grounded her in a way sweet food never could. She risked a glance at him, expecting him to be looking away, but he wasn't. He was watching her. His stillness was both unsettling and incredibly steady. It wasn't the gaze of a man who owned her, nor the gaze of a man who despised her. It was the gaze of someone weighing her, measuring her presence, as if he was trying to decide if she belonged in his world. She dropped her eyes back to the cup, a fresh wave of shame washing over her. Of course she didn't belong here. The storm beat against the cabin walls. The wind howled, and in its cries she could hear the voices of the town, the sneers, the curses, the absolute certainty that she had traded what little dignity she had left for a warm place to sleep. She wrapped her arms around herself, a useless gesture, wishing she could just become invisible. Tahan moved again. He pulled a thick, heavy wool blanket from a wooden trunk in the corner. He laid it on the floor near the hearth, spreading it out with careful, precise movements. Then he made a second gesture, pressing his open palm down on the blanket, a clear and unmistakable signal. This space, this is yours. Her throat tightened until it ached. She had asked for a barn. She had begged for straw and shadows, a place to hide. Instead, he had given her the very center of his home, the spot right by the fire. It was too much. It was a kindness so large it felt like a burden. Her pride screamed at her to refuse, to get up and retreat to the darkest, coldest corner of the cabin. But her body, trembling with an exhaustion that went soul deep, betrayed her. She lowered herself onto the blanket, curling her knees to her chest. The warmth of the fire kissed her face, and her eyelids felt heavy as stones. But even as sleep beckoned, her mind was a whirlwind. She couldn't understand him. Why would he risk the town's wrath for her? Why offer comfort to a stranger when everyone else had offered only contempt? She didn't have any answers, but she knew one thing for certain. Tonight at least, she would not freeze to death. Her breathing finally slowed, but every time a log shifted in the fire, every time a gust of wind rattled the door, she would startle awake, her heart pounding. The faces of the crowd at the station were burned into her mind. Deputy Boone's cold, dismissive stare. Mrs. Pike's sharp, unforgiving tongue. "You'll ruin yourself," they had whispered. Maybe they're right, she thought, turning on her side to face the fire. Across the room, Tahan sat on a low stool. He held a small block of wood and a knife, and he was carving. The blade moved with a steady, hypnotic rhythm, shaving thin curls of wood that fell like pale feathers to the floor around his feet. His eyes never left his work, but she felt his awareness of her like a constant, steady pressure. He knew she was watching. A shape began to emerge from the wood, the graceful curve of a wing, the unmistakable suggestion of a bird in flight. Elah was mesmerized. Each slice of the blade was clean, patient, and full of purpose. It was a language without sound, a story told in wood and steel. It spoke of restraint. It spoke of focus. When he was finished, he stood up, walked over, and set the small wooden bird on the floor beside her blanket. He didn't say a word. He just placed it there and returned to his seat. Elah's chest ached with a feeling so powerful it almost choked her. A gift? A sign? A reminder that even from a rough, worthless piece of wood, something beautiful could be coaxed out with careful hands? She reached out and touched it, her fingers tracing the smooth lines. She was afraid she might break it, but it felt surprisingly strong. She opened her mouth, the word thank you finally ready to take flight. But when she looked up, he had already started on a new carving. Words felt useless, swallowed by the glowing silence of the cabin. Hours passed. The storm howled. Her body finally gave in, and her eyes drifted shut. Her last conscious thought was of the faint, clean scent of cedar and the steady, rhythmic scrape of his knife against wood. She woke up once, deep in the night. There was a sound, boots crunching on the porch, a voice muffled by the snow and the thick walls but full of venom. "Red Elk, you harbor in her. You'll answer for it." Terror, sharp and cold, shot through her veins. She was wide awake, her body rigid, her breath held tight in her chest. She waited for Tahan to rise, to shout back, to do something. He did nothing. He didn't even stop carving. The voice outside cursed, spat, and then the sound of footsteps faded back into the storm. Tahan remained as still as if he were carved from stone himself. Only the constant, steady movement of his knife proved he was alive. Elah lay trembling under the blanket, relief and shame warring inside her. They weren't going to leave them alone. The town's judgment wasn't like the snow. It wouldn't just melt away in the morning. It was iron, and it had been branded onto her skin. But she couldn't deny the strange, powerful stillness of the man across the room. His silence was a shield, and it held her panic at bay. When her eyes finally closed for good, the storm still raging outside, she dreamed not of cold barns or angry faces. She dreamed of firelight and carved birds. She awoke to a world washed in pale, fragile light. The storm had broken. Dawn was slanting through the frosted window. The first thing she saw was Tahan, still sitting in his stool, carving knife in hand, as if the night had been nothing more than a watch he had willingly kept for her. And on the floor beside her blanket, there were now two birds, two perfect wooden birds, their wings outstretched, facing one another. Her breath caught in her throat. She reached for them, her fingers trembling. And in that quiet, sunlit moment, she realized with a jolt that the barn she had begged for was gone forever. And in its place was something far more dangerous. The beginning of belonging. The world outside was silent, buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. It was as if the earth itself had decided to hold its breath. The only sign of life was the steady column of smoke rising from Tahan's chimney, a thin gray line of defiance against the vast, silent sky. Inside the cabin, Ayla moved with a quiet she hadn't known she possessed, brushing ash from the hearth, folding the heavy wool blanket. Every small motion felt huge in the stillness of the room, as if the very walls were watching, memorizing her presence. Tahan stood by the window, the morning light catching the silver edge of the knife he was sharpening with slow, precise strokes. His presence filled the small cabin, a silent gravity that pulled everything toward him. She had been there for 2 days now, 2 days of shared silence, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire. 2 days of chores performed in an awkward, unspoken rhythm. 2 days of meals eaten without a single word passing between them, and though she slept on the floor by the hearth, each morning she woke with the strange, unsettling feeling that she was no longer just surviving. She was being witnessed, and that scared her more than anything. When she stepped outside to gather fresh snow for the water pot, the air was so cold it felt like swallowing glass. She pulled her shawl tight and hurried to the deep drift beside the porch. But then she heard them. Voices, low and bitter, carried on the crisp, still air. She froze, crouching by the snow pile. "Reckon she's in there still?" one of the men muttered. "Red Elk's got her under his roof," another one sneered. "Same as a wife, I'd say. Shame on them both. He'll ruin what's left of her name." Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. She rose slowly, the bucket shaking in her hand. They were standing just beyond the tree line, two townsmen she knew by sight. They saw her, and their eyes turned hard as river stones. One of them tipped his hat in a mocking gesture. "Mornin', barn rat." A hot flush of shame rushed to her cheeks, a stark contrast to the freezing air. She wanted to scream at them, to tell them she had begged for work, that she hadn't chosen this scandal. But her voice was a tiny frozen thing in her throat. Their laughter followed her as she scrambled back inside, slamming the door harder than she meant to. The bang echoed in the quiet cabin. Tahan looked up from his knife. His dark gaze met hers, steady, unreadable. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't have to. The shame was written all over her face. She set the bucket down, her hands trembling so badly that water sloshed over the rim. It was strange. The longer she stayed here, the heavier the shame became, as though she were now carrying not only her own, but his as well. By the afternoon, the sun had burned away the last of the clouds, revealing a town that was restless and buzzing with gossip. Idlaw learned this firsthand when she dared to walk the short path to the well. Mrs. Elnora Pike, a woman whose tongue was sharper than a skinning knife, saw her coming. Her voice pierced the quiet air. "There she goes, throwing herself at that savage. Did you see her face? Not an ounce of shame left in her." Other women, gathered at the well like crows, nodded in agreement, their eyes raking over Ealaw with a cold, cruel satisfaction. Little children, learning their lessons in hatred from their mothers, pointed and giggled. Islaw kept her head bowed, her jaw clenched, her knuckles white on the bucket handle. Every single step back to the cabin felt like she was walking through fire. She burst through the door and collapsed against the wall, clutching the small wooden bird Tahan had carved for her. Her whole body was shaking. Her entire life she had lived under the weight of other people's judgment. But this was different. This was heavier. It wasn't just about her anymore. His silence, his choice to give her shelter, had braided their shames together into one thick, ugly rope. That evening, as the fire hissed and popped, Tahan placed another carving on the floor beside her. This one was smaller than the others, a fledgling, its tiny wings outstretched. "They'll never stop," she whispered, the words breaking apart. "They'll make you suffer because of me." He didn't answer. He just moved to the hearth and added another log to the fire. Sparks flew up, and the sudden flare of light danced across his face. His silence wasn't ignorance. It was a stubborn refusal to bend. But she was terrified that this time it would break them both. The next day brought more than just whispers. It brought the law. Deputy Silas Boone arrived, his heavy boots stamping snow and authority all over the porch. His voice, sharpened by a deep-seated disdain, carried into the cabin before he even opened the door. "You harboring her in there, Red Elk?" The door swung open, and his bulky figure filled the frame, blocking out the light. He smelled of cheap tobacco and self-righteous judgment. Eloy stiffened, her blood turning to ice water. Boone's eyes scanned the room, lingering on Islaw with a smug contempt. "You think the law is just going to let this stand?" he demanded, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. Tahan rose from his stool. He was a good head taller than the deputy, and broader. He said nothing, but the set of his shoulders, the unyielding stillness of his body, was an answer in itself. Boone's eyes narrowed. He turned his attention back to Islam, his words designed to slice her to ribbons. "You'll ruin what's left of yourself, girl. You stay here with him. You're no better than a—" "Enough," Islam whispered. The word was thin, barely audible, but it was there. She was trembling under Boone's venomous stare, his cruelty pressing in on her, making it hard to breathe. The shame screamed at her to run, to disappear, to spare Tahan any more trouble. But then her eyes fell on the carved birds beside her. The two adults, wings outstretched, the fledgling between them. Something inside her, something she thought had died long ago, shifted. She straightened her back. Her voice was clearer this time, and louder. "I asked to sleep in a barn. He gave me fire. That is all." Boone's lip curled into a sneer. "Fire ain't free, Elam." He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her, swallowing her up. But before he could take another step, Tahan moved. He didn't make a sound, but suddenly he was there, a silent, immovable wall of muscle and bone between her and the deputy. For a long, tense moment, the cabin held its breath. Boone's hand twitched, his fingers dancing over the handle of his gun. But he didn't draw. Not yet. Instead, he spat a thick wad of tobacco juice onto the clean floorboards, a final, deliberate mark of his contempt. "This won't end quiet," he muttered. He turned and slammed the door behind him. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. The cabin seemed to shrink after he left, the air thick with his threat. Eloy sank onto the blanket, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Tahan returned to his stool and picked up his carving knife, as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. That night she couldn't sleep. The shame was still there, gnawing at her. But now it was joined by something else, something strange and sharp, a tiny spark of defiance. She had spoken. She had stood up, however weakly, and the world hadn't ended. The fire still burned, and across the room sat a man who had chosen, without a single word, to stand between her and the town's scorn. She studied his silhouette in the shifting firelight, the scars on his shoulders, the patient, steady rhythm of his carving, and for the very first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, silence could be stronger than all their ugly words. Maybe dignity wasn't something you were given. Maybe it was something you fought for, something you carved out of the rough wood of the world. Outside, the snow glistened under a cold, hard moon, hiding the filth of the town's judgment under a clean white sheet. But she knew. Morning would bring the voices again. Morning would bring a reckoning. She curled tighter under the blanket, clutching the wooden bird to her chest. She felt a new storm gathering, not in the sky, but in the hearts of men. A storm that wouldn't stop until she was broken. And when a fist hammered on the door just before dawn, sending a tremor through the entire cabin, she knew with a bone-deep certainty the storm had arrived. The pounding on the door was not a knock. It was an assault. It rattled the very bones of the cabin, shaking loose tiny flakes of frost from the window panes. Isla sat bolt upright, the wool blanket clutched to her chest, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The sound was pure violence. Tahan rose from his stool. He didn't hurry, but there was a tension in his shoulders now, a coiled readiness that hadn't been there before. He crossed the room in two long, silent strides and pulled the door open. A blast of wind and snow burst into the cabin, and with it, the angry growl of voices. Deputy Boone stood on the porch, his long coat flapping around him like the wings of a vulture. He wasn't alone. Flanking him were three other men from town, rifles held loosely but ready across their chests. The gray light of dawn made their faces look like grim, merciless masks. "You've had your chance, Red Elk," Boone barked, his voice cutting through the wind. "The town won't tolerate this filth any longer. She comes with us, now." The words hit Isla like stones. For a split second, she saw it all happen. Them dragging her out into the snow, the spitting, the jeers, the shame finally crushing the last bit of life out of her. Her body screamed at her to hide, to crawl into the darkest corner and disappear. But she knew, with a terrible certainty, that there was nowhere left to hide. Tahan didn't move. He stood solid in the doorway, a mountain of a man with the storm swirling around him. His silence was more defiant than any shout could ever be. Boone's sneer deepened. You think you can just keep her? You think your kind has the right to defy the good people of this town? His hand dropped, hovering just above the handle of his pistol. The men behind him shifted their weight, the barrels of their rifles glinting in the pale light. Isla's heart was pounding so hard she thought it would break right through her ribs. She saw the moment balanced on a knife's edge. She saw how easily blood could be spilled on the fresh white snow. And it was all because of her. All because she had been too hungry, too cold, too desperate to just disappear. The word ripped out of her throat before she could stop it. No! She stumbled forward, her bare feet slapping against the cold floorboards. The men on the porch stared at her, their eyes filled with a mixture of contempt and disgust, as if she were something they'd found stuck to the bottom of their boot. I asked for work, she said, her voice shaking but rising with every word. I asked for a corner of straw to sleep in. He gave me warmth when not a single one of you would. That is my shame to carry, not his. The words poured out of her, a dam of fear and humiliation finally bursting. For the first time in her life, she didn't try to hide her trembling. She let them see it. She let them see the raw truth of her hunger, her cold, her desperation. He owes me nothing, and yet he gave me fire, she cried, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she had. You call that a sin? I call it mercy. The men on the porch shifted uncomfortably. They looked at each other, then back at her. Boone's jaw was clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. His pride had been struck, and it made him even more dangerous. You think mercy is going to protect you, he spat. You'll be nothing but his. Isla flinched, the ugly word landing like a physical blow. But before the wound could fester, Tahan spoke. His voice was low, deep, as if it were coming from the center of the earth. It was a voice carved from stone and ancient trees. Each word was heavy, final. She stays. The air in the cabin grew thick, heavy, charged with violence. Boone's hand tightened on his holster. The world seemed to stop, teetering on the brink. Isla's knees felt weak, but that tiny ember of defiance inside her flared into a flame. She took a step closer to Tahon, close enough that her hand brushed against his arm. She felt the hard muscle coiled beneath his skin, the heat of his resolve. The contact sent a jolt of strength through her. For the first time, she didn't feel like a burden he had to carry. She felt like she was part of his stand. Boone's eyes darted between the two of them, reading the unspoken truth that flowed between them. Pure, unadulterated rage twisted his face. This isn't finished, he spat. He turned sharply, his boots crunching angrily in the snow. His men followed, but they didn't have his certainty. They kept glancing back, their faces a mixture of confusion and unease. The storm seemed to swallow them as they disappeared into the trees. Tahan closed the door, sealing out the wind and the hate. The silence that fell in the cabin was immense, broken only by the sound of Isla's own ragged breathing. She looked up at him, her lips trembling. They'll come back, she whispered. He didn't answer with words, but the fire that burned in his dark eyes told her everything she needed to know. He knew. The rest of the day passed in a tense, waiting silence. Ela scrubbed the table, though it was already clean. She mended a tear in her shawl. Her hands needed to be busy because her thoughts were heavier than stones. Outside, the storm gathered its strength again, the sky closing in, turning a bruised, ugly gray. It felt like the whole world had turned against them. But in the heart of that storm, in the quiet of that cabin, she realized something profound had shifted inside of her. Boone's words, his threats, they hadn't destroyed her. They had burned her, yes. But in the ashes, something stubborn and strong had survived. When evening fell, Tahan set aside his carving tools. He gestured for her to sit by the fire, and she obeyed, sinking onto the familiar comfort of the wool blanket. He knelt by the hearth, feeding it log after log until the flames leaped high, chasing the shadows into the corners and filling the cabin with a defiant golden light. For a long time he just stared into the fire. Then quietly he slid another carving across the floor to her. This one was different from the birds. It was a small figure of a woman. Her arms were folded across her chest. Her head was bowed. But she wasn't broken. Every line of the carving radiated a quiet, unshakable dignity. She stared at it, her throat closing up. Her hand closed around the small wooden figure. A heat stung her eyes, and then the tears came. Not the hot, shameful tears of despair, but tears of release. They fell freely. The first tears she had not tried to fight. I thought I had nothing left, she whispered, her voice trembling. Tahan's dark gaze met hers across the flames. His silence was not empty. It was full of meaning. In it, she felt him recognizing not her shame, but her endurance. She drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders and let the warmth of the fire wash over her. Let the light burn away the shadows inside her. The wind roared outside, rattling the shutters, but inside a fragile peace began to take root. Later that night, she found herself sitting closer to him than before. Their shoulders brushed once, then twice. Neither of them moved away. The warmth that radiated from him was more potent than the fire, more comforting than the blanket. For the first time in more years than she could count, she felt the edge of something that felt like safety. But safety was a fragile thing. The knock on the door came again, sharp, deliberate, louder than before. Ilaw's breath caught. She looked at Tahan, her heart a frantic battleground of fear and defiance. He rose slowly, his hand brushing against hers as he passed, a fleeting touch that was both a comfort and a warning. She clutched the carved woman to her chest, the fire crackling at her back, the storm pressing in on all sides. The door loomed in front of them, a dark rectangle of wood that separated them from the world. And she knew, with a cold, terrifying certainty, that whatever stood on the other side of that door would decide everything. The second knock was heavier, a solid, thudding blow that vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't a request for entry, it was a demand. Ilaw's hand tightened on the small wooden figure, the carved edges digging into her palm. The fire hissed and spat, casting their elongated shadows onto the walls, making them look like giants. Tahan moved to the door, his steps measured and calm. He was a mountain of stillness in the face of the howling storm, both outside the cabin and the one that was brewing on his porch. When he pulled the door open, the world exploded inwards. A furious blast of wind and snow, and three figures, silhouetted against the swirling white chaos. Deputy Boone stood in front, his face a mask of pure hatred. Behind him, two grim-faced men from town, their rifles no longer slung casually, but held at the ready. The night itself seemed to be on their side, wrapping them in a cloak of menace. "You think silence can shield you?" Boone snarled, his voice barely rising above the shriek of the wind. "This ends tonight. She's coming back with us. The town won't stand for her whoring in your cabin." The word whoring struck Islaw like a physical blow. It was a stone hurled through the fragile glass of the safety she had just begun to feel. She pressed herself back against the far wall, her cheeks burning with a shame so hot it felt like it was melting her skin. The accusation wasn't new, but the raw, naked violence behind it was. She could see it in their stances, in the way their knuckles were white on their guns. This was not a visit of words. They had come for blood. Tahan didn't answer. He simply took one step forward, planting himself in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the entire frame. The storm swirled around him, but it could not move him. His silence was no longer just a refusal to speak. It was an act of war. Boone's hand went to his holster. "Step aside, Red Elk." The moment stretched, thin and tight as a wire. Ilaw's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic prisoner. Fear was a heavy, suffocating blanket, but a tiny voice inside her, a voice she barely recognized as her own, whispered, "No more running, no more bending." Her feet moved before her mind could protest. She stepped forward, out of the shadows and into the flickering firelight, taking her place just behind Tahan's formidable frame. The wind whipped her hair across her face and stung her cheeks, but her voice, though it trembled, rose above the storm. I am not leaving. The words rang out, clear and sharp, carried by the wind itself. Boone's eyes snapped to her, narrowing with a vicious disdain. You think that changes what you are? You're a ruined woman, hiding behind a savage. Her breath hitched, but she held his gaze. I asked only for a barn, she shot back, her voice gaining strength. None of you offered it. He gave me fire, and I will not step back into the cold just to comfort your filthy gossip. For a split second, something in Boone's smug certainty faltered. The men behind him shifted on their feet, their eyes darting from Islaw's defiant face to Tahan's immovable form. They were uncertain. This wasn't the broken, shamed creature they had expected, but pride, sharper and more blinding than reason, hardened Boone's face again. Then you've chosen your shame, he spat, and he pulled his pistol. Time seemed to slow down, to thicken like molasses. Idlaw's lungs seized. The firelight glinted off the polished steel of the gun, a terrible promise of blood on the snow. But Tahan moved with a speed that was shocking, almost supernatural. His hand shot out, not to grab the gun, but to slam Boone's arm upwards. The pistol cracked, its thunder immediately swallowed by the storm. The bullet ripped harmlessly into the black, angry sky. The rifles behind Boone lifted, their dark muzzles pointing at Tahan's chest. But before they could fire, Tahan's voice cut through the chaos, low and fierce, a rumbling growl that seemed to shake the very ground. No! More! They were the first words she had ever heard him speak at length, and they carried such an incredible weight, such an undeniable authority, that even the storm seemed to pause to listen. The men froze, their resolve shattered by the raw power in his voice. Boone's face was twisted with fury, but for the first time, Islaw saw something else flicker in his eyes. Fear. She stepped up beside Tahan, her shoulder pressing against his arm. Her voice rose again, stronger now, forged in the fire of his courage. You can call me ruined, she declared, her words lashing at them. You can call me worthless, but you will not stand on this porch and call mercy a sin. Her words struck a different kind of blow. They weren't a weapon of defiance. They were a mirror, forcing them to see the ugliness of their own hearts. Boone's jaw clenched, his pride too stubborn to bend. But he knew in that moment that he had lost. His companions glanced at each other, and their rifles lowered just an inch. The tide had turned. Boone finally spat into the snow, his rage bitter as bile. This isn't over. He turned and stalked off into the blizzard, a dark, defeated shape. His men hesitated for a moment, then hurried after him, their certainty gone, leaving only their shame behind. Tahan closed the door, and the cabin was suddenly, blessedly quiet. The chaos was gone. Islaw's knees gave out, and she sank onto the blanket by the hearth, her body shaking from a flood of adrenaline and relief. The carved woman was still clutched in her hand, now damp with sweat. Tahan crouched beside her. His face was calm, but his eyes were burning with an intensity that took her breath away. He reached out, his rough hand gently covering hers, his thumb brushing over the carving she held. His touch, his silence, it spoke volumes. You are not alone in this. She wept then, not from fear, but from a profound, soul-shaking release. Hot, heavy tears dropped onto the wooden figure's outstretched wings. For so long, she had believed herself to be a ghost, unwanted, unseen. Tonight, she had been seen. She had been defended, not with flowery words, but with presence, with action, with a strength that was as quiet and as powerful as the mountains themselves. The shame that had been her constant companion for years now seemed small and insignificant, a pale shadow next to the steady, brilliant fire that burned beside her. When her sobs finally quieted, she looked at him, really looked at him, at the scars that told a story of survival, at the steady hands that could create beauty from a worthless piece of wood, at the patient silence that was a language all its own. And she knew, with an unshakable certainty, that the bond between them was not an accident of a storm or an act of desperation. It was something that had been forged in fire and tempered in judgment. The storm raged all through the night, but inside the small cabin, They remained close to the hearth. Their shoulders brushed once, then again. Neither of them moved away. When sleep finally came for her, it was not the restless, haunted sleep of hunger and shame. It was heavy and deep and safe. She woke to the light. The storm had broken, leaving behind a sky the color of a pale blue robin's egg. A thick, perfect blanket of snow draped the world in a profound silence. The air was crisp and clean with the promise of a new beginning. She sat up, blinking in the bright sunlight that was spilling through the frosted window. Tahan was already outside. The cabin door was ajar, and she could see his breath rising in white clouds in the cold morning air. He was working, the rhythmic sound of a hammer striking wood echoing in the stillness. Isla pulled her shawl around her shoulders and stepped out onto the porch. She stopped, stunned. He was framing an addition to the cabin, his movements steady and sure, his powerful arms driving nails into fresh-cut timber. A new room. She approached him slowly, the snow crunching under her worn boots. "What? What are you doing?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He paused his work and turned to meet her gaze. His eyes, dark and steady, held a universe of unspoken meaning. He lifted one hand and laid it flat against a new wooden beam, his palm pressing against the rough wood. "Room," he said. The word was quiet, but it struck her with the force of a thunderclap. Room, not just shelter, not just a place to survive. Space. Space for her. Space for her life, for her dignity, for her to belong. Her chest ached with an emotion so powerful it threatened to break her. Tears welled in her eyes again, but these were different. They were soft and warm, and they carried not shame, but a fragile, luminous hope. She moved closer until she was standing beside him. She reached out and placed her hand on the fresh wood right next to his. Her fingers, smaller and trembling, pressed against the beam. The cold bit at her skin, but the warmth that seemed to flow between their hands was stronger. The dawn spread across the snow, turning the entire world to gold. The small cabin stood like a sentinel against the vast white landscape, smoke curling steadily from its chimney. And for the first time in her life, Isla felt the crushing weight of judgment lift from her shoulders, replaced by something she had never dared to imagine. The beginning of home. She turned to him, her voice soft but unwavering. "I'll stay." He didn't answer with words. He didn't need to. The fire in his eyes, the quiet tilt of his head, the way his hand lingered on the beam beside hers, it told her everything. But then he did speak. His voice was quiet, rough with a pain that was old and deep. "My wife," he said, his gaze fixed on the distant snow-covered mountains. "She was, like you, proud. The town." They did not understand her. He paused, his throat working. "She died, in a storm like this one, alone." He finally turned his head and looked directly at Isla, and in his eyes she saw the ghost of a heartbreak so vast it could swallow mountains. "Never again," he whispered. And in that moment, everything clicked into place. His silence wasn't just his nature. It was a fortress he had built around his grief. His protection of her wasn't random charity. It was a sacred promise he was keeping to the memory of the woman he had lost. The carved birds, the wolf, the woman, they weren't just gifts. They were the chapters of a story he couldn't bring himself to speak. The story of a lone bird finding another. The story of a protector standing his ground. The story of two broken people finding their way home, together. The sun climbed higher, casting its brilliant light over a world made clean and new. The barn Isla had begged for, with its cold and its shadows, had never been her salvation. Salvation was here. It was in the fire that had been freely offered, in the silence that had been a shield, and in the dawn that promised not just survival, but a life worth living. Mercy is not weakness, and dignity is not something that can be given or taken away by the cruel mouths of others. Sometimes it begins in the snow, in the silence, in the steady, outstretched hand of the one person who sees you not for the shame you carry, but for the fire you hold inside. When the world hurls its judgment, let your courage be the answer. If this story of unlikely heroes and quiet strength moved you, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications. You won't want to miss the incredible stories we uncover next.